Anyway, good afternoon to all of you, and many thanks for having me here today. Kathryn Fitzgerald is my name. I've been a practicing teacher for 29 years, and I worked since 2012 with the Special Education Support Service, mainly in the area around behaviour. Since 2017, we've amalgamated into the NCSE, which is the National Council for Special Education. So if you don't know what that looks like, I'm going to just show you on the first few slides who we are and what we do, really. I suppose the NCSE is a statutory body, and we have a couple of areas that we work in. We have a policy and practice side, which is where I live at the moment. And then we have an operational side, which is the side you'd probably be more familiar with from being around in schools and seeing the resources and so on. I suppose behind the NCSE is the idea that we're trying to meet students' need and improve the long-term outcomes for students with special education needs. Okay, so what we actually do then is we have a number of different roles. So you'll be familiar with the role of the SNA, the Special Education Needs Organisers. You'll see those in school. If you have a child with a hearing or visual impairment, you'll be familiar with the visiting teachers. We also do, on the research side, we do quite a serious research, and that feeds into policy advice. And policy advice then goes to government, and government decide on the policy, and then it comes back through the Department of Education. We also are moving into the role of developing services for adults with special education needs in an educational context. So we work right across the continuum of provision in Ireland, so special schools, special classes, mainstream schools, all areas of the service are involved in all those supports. We have a number of supports that you'd be familiar with when you're around schools all the time. So we support teaching and learning, sensory, behaviour. We give in-school support, continual professional development for teachers, which is now moving into the area of continuing professional development for SNAs, as we call them now, and whole school communities. Continued support for school leaders so that they're able and that they have the skills and knowledge to implement the right and the correct methods of supporting our students. We also support parents and guardians, and I see there's a desk out there with a lot of our leaflets and so on. We have a huge role in providing assistive technology to students who need it, and we also allocate resources, and you'll be familiar with the resource teachers. Those are all allocated by NCSE, okay? And every year those are reviewed and reallocated and so on. I was asked to do this at very, very short notice. So what I did was I distilled everything for you. So I really kind of, given the time frame that we have, tried to take a large amount of information and make it very, very small. So be conscious of that, okay? There are huge tomes of literature available around the research, but it's very difficult to read them. They're heavy, they're academic, the language in them is quite difficult. So what I've tried to do is pull out what could be relevant to you today, and I'm hoping that this is what you're looking for. So I've taken the three main research or policy advice areas that I've looked at in terms of behavioural management and in terms of restraint and seclusion are the ones around autism, the ones around severe emotional and behavioural difficulties, and the most recent policy advice is the 2018 SNA review and advice. Okay, so those are the three areas where I looked at where there was advice and recommendations most relevant to behaviour management, okay, and the issues that are around all of that. So we know that we have to put advice out there so the department can work on it and that it eventually filters downwards. But I suppose at the back, behind all this research and policy and all of that, really the needs of the child are central. So all policy advice would be focused on the needs of the children in the schools and in the services, and what supports are needed then to support the students in their environment, keeping in mind that we want long-term positive outcomes for these students. Okay. Now, when we're talking about behavioural needs, we all know as parents that you can have a behavioural need that's very, very small and it's intermittent and it's very hard to keep track of it. Or you can have severe and very, very challenging, complex behavioural needs and behavioural, I suppose, explosions, for want of a better word, that are hugely challenging to the student themselves, to the people around him, to the peers in the classroom, to the teacher, to the SNA, to the parent, and the fallout among the whole staff, the whole community around those behaviours. Now, we also know that some students who have special needs do not have challenging behaviours, okay? But if you think of it as a pyramid, okay, as a pyramid shape, the students with the severest behaviours are up at the top of that pyramid, and it's around about 2 to 5% of the students with special education needs are up there at that top, okay? And they're the ones that we're really focusing in on today. What are the recommendations, what's being advised, and what can we do about it? So we know that behaviours arise from different things, but most of these very serious behaviours come from emotional and behavioural conditions. Okay, and you will have heard EBD as a kind of a catchphrase. So emotional behavioural disorders or severe emotional behavioural disorders, or sometimes in primary school we have social mixed in there. So you have the social emotional category. Another thing is that many of our students with these behavioural difficulties cannot or have never been taught to self-regulate their behaviours. What does that mean? Well, for me it means when I'm nervous, I can recognise my nervousness. I have butterflies in my stomach, so a child with autism may not recognise that he has butterflies in his stomach. He may not be able to have a strategy to regulate that emotion. So for me, when I recognise that I'm nervous and I have butterflies, I take deep breaths, I slow myself down, I focus on something. So a child who's unable to recognise or qualify or put language on these emotions cannot self-regulate, and they have to be taught to self-regulate. And that's hugely important because at the moment, children who are involved in very violent and very physical aggressive behaviour don't have that, and yet are they being taught it, and do the teachers have the skills to teach it? Do they have the knowledge about it? And very often we know we're in a position where the SNAs dealing with these children are untrained in the area of severe behaviour management. Okay, so the students who are experiencing this don't have, in a lot of cases, the adults with the capacity, the skills or the knowledge to manage that behaviour and to improve the behaviour, okay, or to lessen those outbursts or to manage what's happening. And so we have what's happening on the ground. Now, we can't look at the recommendations in isolation. Okay, that will be very important. So we're making recommendations, but we're saying don't look at them just as recommendations from the NCSE. There are literally hundreds of recommendations coming out of the policy documents. Okay, so you could take one and you could say, this is where my child is, this is what's recommended and this is what applies to me. But it's a kind of a murky water when you do that, because the recommendations are very far-ranging, wide-reaching recommendations. And we know that they apply to some students and not all. And we know that behaviours are on a continuum, that some are very mild but can grow to be severe. We know that some are severe for a very, very long time. I was in a special school yesterday and I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of the students there. And one of them was a 17-year-old boy with autism who had been expelled from 3 previous placements. And because of the methodology that was used to target his behaviour, to recognise the communication in his behaviour, to recognise the triggers in his behaviour, there was a data-driven, a provision of support put in for this student. And over the last 2 years, he has got to the stage where he can self-regulate his behaviour and where he uses a quiet area for times of anxiety and stress, and he has survived the school system, and he's doing very, very well in terms of his overall development. Okay, so it was fantastic to see that, but it also came with a background that for many years this child was struggling with his behaviours, and the people who engaged with him were also struggling with his behaviours. So the recommendations, we're talking about recommendations for very, very, very serious physical assault situations where there's huge levels of aggression. And what the NCSE would recognise, I suppose, that in a lot of the cases the behaviour is being contained. Okay, they're containing the behaviour. But because the behaviours are continuing or disimproving, the behaviour isn't being worked on to lessen its frequency or to lessen the impact that the child is having on anybody else. So it's not being improved in any way. Okay. So the challenging behaviours will have serious consequences, and we know that they have serious consequences in schools every single day. What we'd be saying, if the recommendations are not put in place that we have given, there will be very serious consequences, and we're being faced with this. Teachers are being faced with it, parents are being faced with it, where there are people being physically hurt, stress levels are very, very high, emotions are running very, very high, but yet we're waiting for something to be done about it, really. So we do, I suppose, have some recommendations that will bring about long-lasting change. Okay. The one I'd have a look at here that's on the board for you is the SNA scheme. It took 2 years to complete this review of the SNA scheme, and it was published last May, I think. And there were, amongst other recommendations, there were 13 very important ones. And if you feel like looking it up, all of these are available on the NCSE website. And these recommendations are about page 43 onwards, if anyone wants to have a look at them. So what we're saying, when we looked overall at what was going on with SNAs in schools, that students, teachers and SNAs, but mostly the students, need to have the right person with the right support at the right time. Okay? And that person that's giving the support to the student must be appropriately qualified. Okay? So that's not really happening on a wide scale at the moment. There must be a range of support options, because we know that students who have severe challenging behaviour often have other conditions as well. Okay, it doesn't usually occur for no reason. There are other reasons for it. So one size does not fit all. It must be targeted at the behaviours of an individual child, but it must be from an appropriately qualified person. Qualification isn't everything, though. You can have the qualification and not have the skill. So we must try to ensure that there are skilled teachers and skilled SNAs in place. A range of options, a range of supports, okay? You can have a behaviour management strategy, you can have a behaviour management analyst, but that's not everything, is it? So many of your students, many of your children will need occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. If they have complex medical needs, okay, they will also need sort of intimate care. Okay, so SNAs must also be trained into providing that. So there must be a huge range of options available. So where do we start with that? One of the important recommendations is that we start to train our teachers and SNAs. Okay, and I know that a lot of you will have come across teachers who don't have the training, and that's not their fault. But there is training available for teachers. There is CPD available continually on behaviour, and it is one of the biggest draws. 5 minutes, Kathryn. 5, okay. I'm not going to get to the end of this. The behaviour support is one of the biggest draws we have on the service. So again, not looking at any of the recommendations in isolation, schools and teachers need to link in with the other support services other than NCSE, like CAMS. So that's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health, and NEPS. Every school should have, but probably doesn't have a NEPS psychologist attached to it. Other recommendations, so SNAs are going to be called gradually over time inclusion support assistants. Okay, the name will change. There's a change around the vocabulary here. Okay, so the Department of Education, what we're saying is ring fence the finance and the resources for training in teachers and SNAs in the management of severe challenging behaviours. They're saying there should be behaviour practitioners available for schools to draw on for support and advice. The DES should arrange for the immediate and very urgent publication of guidelines for schools on the management of behaviour in crisis situations. Okay, they're the main ones. Restrictive practices also come into that. We need huge guidelines, specific, clear, relevant guidelines, okay, relevant to our situations. We need behaviour practitioners on the ground out there. We need to be able to train teachers to address the root causes of the behavioural disturbances, of the really severe challenging behaviour. What are the triggers? What is the communication intent of the child? Many teachers are not trained in this area, and we need to make sure that younger teachers coming out of colleges are going to a college which has the relevant, focused, specific, evidence-based teaching of special education needs in teacher training. We also need to support our newly qualified teachers who will come out of college with very little teaching experience in the management of challenging behaviours. So without that relevant advice and without that being put into place, we are facing, again, serious consequences, but we're also facing the fact that the children's behaviour won't be improved. It can't be without it. Very quickly, we look again at, we would recommend that the department publish guidelines around the use of time-out rooms in schools. No school should have a time-out room, okay? There is no evidence base to suggest that time-out rooms are effective. What we're looking at is quiet spaces, quiet areas with sensory input for children who can eventually not be forced into a time-out space or a time-away space or a quiet space, but through self-regulation and self-management of the behaviours, no matter what their level of verbal ability or their communication, or whether they communicate with pictures or with sign language or with assistive technology, that they will be able to choose when they recognise their behaviours are escalating, that they will be able to choose to move away from the behavioural where the trigger has happened and into an area where they can calm down and be cooled, and whether they will have, you know, a person with them or beside them or just at the door or whatever. Those guidelines are needed fairly urgently. Again, it's usually a sensory area. Okay, a safe sensory area is what we're looking at. So we do, again, need some policy advice from the government fairly urgently on that. Some of the other recommendations that come from the three reports that I mentioned at the beginning is that we really need to focus on the training of the teachers, the training. So I think ring-fenced financial resources to put towards that is a fairly urgent one. The other recommendation, which I suppose would have a direct impact in the schools, is that there would be a behavioural analyst or a behavioural support teacher allocated to mainstream schools, one per school, who would have responsibility for an assigned number of students and would be trained specifically in the management of severe challenging behaviour. And I think I'm on the 20, am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, as I say, I could really talk to you for much longer time. I've tried to condense it as much as I could. I hope it made sense to you. Everything I've presented today, it's been quite information heavy, and I'm aware of that. But everything is grounded in the research reports and the policy advice reports, which are all available on the website. And should you need to contact us, there are 2 centres at the moment that you can contact through. One is in Navan, one is in Cork. The NCHC itself is based in Trim in County Meath, but those are the contact details should anybody need them. And I'd just like to thank you for having me here today and wish you the very best of luck with the outcomes from your consultation, and hope I'll be hearing about it fairly soon. Thank you very much.